So here what we want to do, we're trying to express this 8 cosine x plus 15 sine x in equivalent form with just the cosine. So we got r, which is a constant to be found, r cosine x minus alpha. So we need to find this alpha. So how can we do that? Well, we've got cosine and sine here, we've got cosine, and in the input here we've got a difference. So the clue there is maybe to use the sum and difference formula for cosine. So what we can use, let's write it here. Cosine of A plus or minus B. We can write that in the form of cosine A cosine B minus or plus. Notice the signs here are flipped depending on what your input is. And then we've got sine A sine of B. Okay, so that's our starting point with our sum and difference formulas. Now here we've got x minus alpha, so we need to rewrite this in terms of x minus alpha. So that's what we want. So we want cosine of x minus alpha. So with a minus on the input, we need a plus here for our result. So then we'll have cosine x cosine alpha, and then plus sine x sine alpha. Okay, we need the result like this with an r, so let's put an r inside here. So that's kind of what we want in the end. So there's our stuff to work with. Now we're using this 8 cosine x plus 15 sine x. So what we want now is to have this equal to this somehow. So if I just write this here now, 8 cosine x plus 15 sine x, and then we just write inside here our r value, because we need to multiply this by some sort of constant. So when I put my r in there, what I can do is I can put that there. So then we've got r cosine x cosine alpha plus r sine x sine alpha. And that's all my building blocks now ready. Now what I need to do now here, I notice here I've got an 8 cosine x, and I've got all my cosine terms here together with the r. I've got a 15 sine x here with an r sine x sine alpha. So I've got all my sine terms together. So what I can do now is use corresponding coefficients to try and find an alpha or an r somehow. So let's just plug these things in and see what happens. So I've got 8 cosine x. So I've got cosine x there. So to match the coefficient with cosine x, I've got r cosine alpha left over. That should be equal to 8. So there's my first thing I can use. And then here I've got 15 sine x. So sine x is there, and I've got sine x here. So for that to be a matching corresponding coefficient, 15 should be r sine alpha. So r sine alpha should equal 15. Okay, that's all well and good, but this on its own is not going to help me. But what I do know, I have a nice little trig identity. So I do know sine squared, let's call it alpha, plus cosine squared alpha, that is always equal to 1 regardless of our input and regardless of what our parameter is here. So what I could do now, let's just square both and set them equal to, well, whatever these are. So if I've got r, if I do r squared cosine squared alpha, so if I square this one, I square that one. So that equals 64. Square this one, square that one. So then I've got r squared sine squared alpha equals 225. That's what I got there. Now what I can do, I can just add these together. So if I add them together, what I've got now is r squared cosine squared alpha plus r squared sine squared alpha. 64 plus 225 is 289. Okay, now let's just factor out the r squared to get the cosine squared and sine squared as required. So now I've got r squared cosine squared alpha plus sine squared alpha equals 289. Now I know this is just 1 from famous trig identity, so this is equal to 1. So then I've got r squared is 289. So then r equals the square root of 289. So here's where I can ignore the negative value. So r equals 17. Okay, so that's what I've got so far. So my first part here, r is 17. So that's all good. Now I need to find my alpha. So how can I find alpha? Well, what I can do is I've got cosine and sine of this here, r sine alpha, cosine alpha. What I can do is, if I just find tangent alpha, that's going to be this one, sine over cosine, isn't it? So r sine alpha, r cosine alpha. And that will give me my tangent. So tangent alpha is this. Now what have I got here? R sine alpha is 15, r cosine alpha is 8. So that's 15 over 8. Okay, now let's just solve for alpha. So then alpha is the inverse tangent of 15 over 8. Remember, we're working in degrees here, not in radians. So therefore, if you just plug that in your calculator, you should get to 1 decimal place 61.9. So then alpha is 61.9 degrees, 1 decimal place. So now we've got all our building blocks for this. We've got 17 and 61.9. So let's just write our result here. So I've got 17 cosine of x minus 61.9 degrees. And that's our answer in terms of degrees. And we are done.